If I could ask everyone to take their seats, we'd like to get started. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this auspicious day. I am Harris Steinberg, Executive Director of the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation at Drexel University, and I had the distinct privilege of being the chair of the Mayor's Task Force on Historic Preservation. On behalf of the task force, I am thrilled to release our final report that was more than 18 months in the making, and there are copies of the report on the side table as you walk in. I am even more excited that Mayor Kenney and Councilman Squilla are here to outline our next steps. Over many months, task force members came to the table through large and small group meetings 2 to 3 times per month to have conversations about preservation. It wasn't easy. Task force members represented a wide range of views of preservation, from preservationists to architects to lawyers to developers to community members. As you may expect, our views did not always align with one another. Tough conversations were had, best practices were reviewed, and many ideas were put forward. The public was witness to our process through a series of open meetings and workshops, and their input and feedback were critical to our deliberations. The work of Penn Praxis and the development of their toolkit helped the task force gain an understanding of the issues that cut across a variety of neighborhoods across the city. Ultimately, what emerged from this work was not just this set of recommendations, but also a better understanding of the issues around preservation and one another. Relationships between task force members forged during this process have continued, which can only serve to strengthen preservation and continue the discussions started in this process. Now I have the privilege to introduce Dominique Hawkins, who served as my vice chair of the task force, who will present an overview of the recommendations.
Thank you, Harris. Good morning. My name is Dominique Hawkins, and as announced, I was the vice chair of the task force and the co-chair of the regulatory committee. The task force was charged with looking at 4 primary topics around preservation: survey, regulation, incentives, and education and outreach. 4 subcommittees were formed around those topics. When it came out of this process was a set of 8 recommendations to improve preservation outcomes in the city. In your media packet, you will find the executive summary that includes a list of all recommendations. And on philpreservation.org, you will find both the executive summary and the entire report with its details. I will highlight just a few of the recommendations this morning. The task force felt strongly that for preservation to be successful, the city should start with its own policies and procedures. The report outlines ways for city agencies to engage more proactively with preservation in their own departments through coordination of efforts, review policies, and providing support to developers of historic properties. In order to facilitate broader preservation of buildings and neighborhoods, the city must first know what it has. We recommended an ongoing survey program, including the tools to collect and store this information. While much data about the built environment exists in the city, state, and with other partners, it is critical that this information live in one place to help inform decisions across the city, including what should be preserved. To further protect the city's historic fabric, the task force is recommending that the city create a one-time index of historic properties that meet designation criteria and whose ability to be designated would be reviewed if a demolition permit was sought. We also recommend that there be additional types of historic and conservation districts to improve the kinds of tools that communities have to protect their neighborhoods. Increasing incentives for historic preservation must be done hand in hand with increasing regulation and designation. The task force is recommending a long list of incentives, from new and enhanced zoning regulations for historic properties to increase existing and introducing new city-led financial programs. Protection for archaeological resources should also be enhanced beyond what the current ordinance is able to provide. Throughout the task force work, we discussed the need to bring clarity and transparency to the process of historic preservation. For historic designations, this process of notification and review can seem obscure to owners and to communities. While the Commission's current rules and regulations provide flexibility for reviewing alterations to historic properties, that process is not always clear to the average permit applicant. Finally, in order to truly support preservation, we must bring more people to the table. Broadening the constituency for preservation is essential to ensuring that we understand what is important to preserve. And with that, we are pleased to present the final report to Mayor Kinney and the public. Harris?
Thank you, Dominique. Before I introduce the mayor, who is anxiously waiting to talk about the recommendations, I'd like just the members of the task force who are here with us today to stand up and be recognized. Thank you. This is about a third of our 33-member task force, and it's wonderful to see everybody here today. So now, without further ado, Mayor Jim Kenney and the recommendations for the task force.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a happier day than that, isn't it? Today is an exciting day for historic preservation in Philadelphia. Not only are we hearing the final recommendations of the Historic Preservation Task Force, but we are taking the first steps to actually implement them. These actions will help preserve what makes Philadelphia unique, our historic assets. First, we will have an ongoing citywide survey program to fully document our historic resources. We have started to update our current data management system so we can better keep track of this historic information. Next, the Historical Commission, the Law Department, and the Planning Commission have begun to draft an ordinance and language to create 2 new tiers of historic preservation. This will enable us to protect more properties. Councilmember Squilla will introduce the legislation to create additional incentives for historic preservation. When it passes, I will sign it right away. Councilman Squilla will tell us more about that in a moment. Also, our administration has formed an historic preservation policy team, which includes representatives from the Mayor's Office, Historical Commission, City Planning Commission, License and Inspection, Parks and Rec, Commerce, Finance, Public Property, Law, Office of Transportation, and Sustainability. They will meet regularly to break down any silos that prevent city government from fully supporting historic preservation. We are committed to improving clarity and transparency in the designation process and in the permit review process for historically designated properties. Additionally, we are looking long-term strategies, working with the Law Department to see how we create a list of properties for historic review before issuing a demolition permit, looking at energy code standards that may need to be modified for historic properties, working with the Law Department, Historical Commission, and the Philadelphia Archaeological Forum to better honor underground artifacts. And we also need to build a broader constituency for and around historic preservation. Whether you live in Germantown, Frankfurt, Girard Estates, or in almost any neighborhood in our city, you are surrounded by history, from buildings to parks. We need to appreciate and preserve that history. And I look forward to working with advocates, developers, local historical societies, educators, city council, and residents to elevate and protect the one thing Philadelphia has that no other city can match, and that's our fabulous history. Before I sit down, I want to thank the task force members that you've seen here and all those who are not here, staff at the Historical Commission and the Planning Commission, and the Department of Planning and Development, the National Trust for Historic Preservation for researching best practices, the wonderful William Penn Foundation that we always rely on for providing funding for the work of the task force, and most of all, the residents of Philadelphia who lent their voices to this process. Whether by attending a task force meeting, participating in an interactive workshop, or submitting written comments, your input has strengthened this report. I believe we are at a turning point in the protection of our city's historic sites, and I'm excited to get to work. So again, everyone here, thank you very much for all your interest and your help. I know it's a very confusing process, and we're trying to make it less confusing and more direct and more transparent. So thanks again for all you've done. And I think, is Mark up next? Thanks. Probably the district council person with the most historic buildings, probably in the nation. And he has to deal with this conflict all the time, and he does a very good job at balancing it. And hopefully, these tools will allow him to balance it even better and to preserve more properties. Councilman Squilla.
Thank you, Mayor. And it is I was proud and honored to be selected as a council representative for the Historic Task Force, and thank you to Harris and Dominique for all your work and effort that you put in, and the whole task force for the time that was put into this. And you know, looking at all these different acts and other municipalities that have preservation strategies, trying to put them together and see how it works in Philadelphia wasn't an easy task, and to come up with recommendations was not also an easy task. And the task force was able to put this together, put it succinctly, and put it into something that we could understand and give us a roadmap to move forward. And as somebody said earlier today, that this is just the beginning. You know, there's a little flower and it's just starting to bud, and now, hopefully, by the time we're done legislation, we'll see a full bloom of historic preservation here in our city of Philadelphia. So I'm pleased to hear that the mayor say that the administration will be taking immediate steps on issues that we can act on unilaterally. And that's important because some things, not everything, needs legislation in order to improve. But representing the incentives committee on the historic task force, we saw some requirements that would need some incentives through legislation. And I am willing to work with my colleagues to introduce these bills in order to make sure that we have access to see and help people want to preserve buildings. You know, sometimes we're very reactive on historic natures, and what we want to do is we want to make that proactive. We want to be able to go out there ahead of time and to be to designate things. Don't go after the fact and developers are doing something and then say, all right, we're going to make it historic now, or it was historic, but we didn't have it marked historic. We want everybody to know what we have in our city of Philadelphia and how we cherish it and how we want to protect it, and therefore they know ahead of time. And then we could put these incentives in place to help people instead of saying, no, we don't want to be in a historic building or in a historic area or an historic district, but we do want to be because those incentives make it really great for us to be able to preserve our history here in the city of Philadelphia. So specifically, we're going to work with my colleagues to introduce legislation to reduce or eliminate parking requirements for redevelopment of historic buildings. Now, this is sometimes a controversial aspect. If you go to community meetings throughout the city of Philadelphia, the first thing people talk about any development is parking. But if we're serious about looking to preserve our history, we need to be able to put some of these incentives in place, and parking is one of them, because a lot of these buildings cannot be altered, and therefore to have them have to put parking in is a detriment to that development. Allowing accessory dwelling units on historic properties, increase by right use opportunities for special purpose buildings, such as churches and schools. We've seen recently with St. Laurentius churches with an opportunity to keep a structure there and is being fought back and forth because of certain uses that aren't allowed in those buildings. If we had these incentives by right, the developer could come in there, reclaim that structure, make it beautiful as what it is and historic, and then use the building for the uses that would be considered. Creating a zoning bonus to fund new historic preservation fund. We as preservationists see the opportunity to have a fund to help people. And if people see that we are serious about helping them, they will be more than willing to have their property designated historic or an area designated historic so that we could work with them to keep the vibrancy of our city and also remember the history of our city. And we want to create 2 new types of districts, allowing for more options for preserving our neighborhoods. And that is something that's called a tiering option. If you have districts, there's a certain regulations assigned to each district. By tiering them or having different districts, some will be more restrictive and some will be less restrictive, but it gives us the opportunity to then engage more areas of the city to put protections in place. So most of the developers do want to do the right thing. These changes to our zoning code will help make the numbers work for developers, working with the historic properties, but also work with the communities to make sure their input is heard. They will also help retain the historic characters of homeowners, preserve their historic homes, and that I appreciate the mayor and what he has said in supporting these bills. I look forward to working with my colleagues on City Council to further develop ideas to work through this process and to move the needle forward to preserve our history and to work with the Preservation Alliance. And I know I saw Paul and Pat here and everybody on the team, knowing that we work together to be proactive. This will be a very, very important aspect of the city moving forward to protect our history and our historic buildings. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Councilman Squilla and to Mayor Kenny. I think the proof is in the pudding, as they say. The fact that the mayor convened this task force 2 years ago, that we have a set of recommendations on the table, and they're already acting on them, I think demonstrates the commitment of the city, not only to the purpose of preservation, but how it can democratize preservation in this city for a much wider constituency. So thank you both very much for your not only participation, but your embracing of the recommendations. With that, I'd like to introduce Sari Warden, who is with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They gave us access to a much broader network of best practices that really helped to inform the work of the task force, and Sari participated in the task force herself. So, Sari.
Thank you for that introduction, Harris, and thank you so much, Mayor Kenny, for the opportunity to stand with you all today in support of affirming the role preservation will have in the future of Philadelphia. As has been said, the National Trust for Historic Preservation was invited to serve as a technical advisor to the task force, and in particular, to provide research, data, tools, and strategies to help Philadelphia streamline and support the renewal and repurposing of your many, many older and historic buildings. It has been a true privilege to work alongside distinguished local preservation groups, including staff at the city's planning and historical commissions, and of course, the Preservation Alliance of Greater Philadelphia, along with my many, many task force members. To learn from you and with you the opportunities and challenges facing this great and very historic city has been a truly rewarding experience for me and for the National Trust as well. The Trust is proud of the work this task force has produced, and we are truly invigorated and gratified to see Mayor Kenny's embrace of the many collective recommendations that came out of this task force. Our research at the Trust has shown there's no one magic silver bullet, and we commend the mayor for his many wide-ranging and comprehensive approaches to promoting the preservation and reuse of Philadelphia's historic fabric. And though the work of the task force may be ending, the work to ensure the city's rich and historic fabric remain key building blocks for future development is ongoing. And the National Trust and I look forward to remaining on the ground and engaged in the years to come. Thank you so much.
A special shout out again to the William Penn Foundation, whose resources helped us bring on the National Trust. Next up is Paul Stanke, who leads our Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia. This really is about the village, kind of protecting the village. So, Paul, you're up.
Thank you, Harris, and thank you, Dominique. And good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Steinke, Executive Director of the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia. And as I go around to the city talking about historic preservation, I always like to start out by saying this is a 300-year-old city with architectural history and legacy second to none. I don't care where you go in the United States, whether it's Boston or Charleston, this is one of our main assets. And I think that is the foundation on which all of our work at the Preservation Alliance is done. And that's the spirit that we approach our work. And so this task force, I think, was also built on that same idea, that we have something really special here in Philadelphia that's worth understanding and worth protecting. And so I do want to thank Mayor Kenny and his administration for putting this task force together. You know, we're in a very different era right now in Philadelphia. For most of our time as preservationists, we fought decline and abandonment and emptiness, trying to save buildings like the Victory Building or the Naval Home that were empty and blighted and threatened with being demolished just from lack of use. In the last decade, thanks to the growth of this city, we've seen, which is a great thing, growth in population, growth in the tax base. Philadelphia is thriving again in many respects, but it also has put increased pressure on our historic building inventory. And so the fact that this task force was put together and the work that it has done represents perhaps the most ambitious effort to update and reform our city's preservation laws and regulations that any mayor has ever done. And I do want to pause for a moment and thank Mayor Kenny for doing this. Thank you, sir. And while I'm thanking folks, I do want to thank all the members of the task force, including our Director of Advocacy, Patrick Grossi, who represented the Alliance on the task force, for the excellent work and all the time you put in, all those far-flung meetings in Northeast Philly and Germantown and South Philly as this process unfolded, and our colleagues at the National Trust, represented here by Sari Warden, our great partners, not only in this effort, but in a lot that we do at the Preservation Alliance. But as Councilman Squilla said, I'm going to paraphrase him a little bit, this represents the end of the beginning. And now the hard work really begins to embrace these ideas, to begin to implement them. And I'm really pleased that we have the support and the cooperation and the enthusiasm of people in the administration, in planning and development, in the Historical Commission, who are prepared to take on these challenges, as well as, we hope, in City Council, led by our Chief Councilman Preservationist, Councilman Squilla. So we look forward to working with you all as we go forward. We do need to survey what we have and understand what we have through an inventory. We do need to strengthen regulations and incentives. And as far as the Preservation Alliance is concerned, and we have several board members in the room from the Alliance, we've been thinking a lot about how this work and these recommendations will affect what we do going forward and how it will change and inform the work that we do. Whether it's through our tour program, which starts next month and goes out into neighborhoods across the city, whether it's through our educational programs and how we can spread the word about the economic value of preservation and the importance of preservation to our city, and even updating our collateral materials, which are a little bit out of date. And we'll definitely be embracing and using the wonderful Preservation Tool Guide, which I think there are copies over there, that Penn Praxis put together. So we're really excited. We've been waiting for this day. We're delighted with the priorities that the administration is setting going forward. And now, like I said, end of the beginning, let's get to work. Thanks all.
Thank you, Paul. Teed up beautifully Julie D'Onofrio, who is up next to talk about the work of the toolkit that Penn Praxis put together, which is really about community outreach and how we broaden the constituency for preservation in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Harris, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thanks especially to Mayor Kenny for convening, and also to the amazing work of the task force that has been working quite ardently to get us to where we are today. So as was stated, Penn Praxis joins the task force in being committed to broadening the constituency for preservation in Philadelphia, and also broadening the definition of what historic preservation might mean to a variety of community members. So last year, in running parallel to the task force, Penn Praxis ran a project that we called the Historic Preservation Citizen Engagement Project, which went out to neighborhoods across the city in order to have candid, intimate conversations to discuss places that matter in communities and why. We worked closely with the Citizens Planning Institute, which is a part of the Planning Commission, and they helped us connect us with 21 community liaisons that were embedded in neighborhoods that look very different from one another, all the way from the Northeast to South Philly to West Philly, to have these focused conversations to talk about the various aspects of preservation. So using that information, we both used it to put together the toolkit, which is on the table over there, but we also used it to inform the work of the task force throughout the process, beginning about a year ago this month, so that we could inform the recommendations insofar as how could we be communicating these themes in a different way. So following that, we created this toolkit, which has 5 sections, and it really does talk more about the preservation of a historic building. It talks about how how one might become involved in their neighborhood to gather together future constituents, how they might preserve commercial corridors, how they might advocate and change policy. And so it really does go beyond just the built fabric. Similarly, aligning with the recommendations that came forward through the task force, it's not just about outreach and education. It's about communicating things like, tiered districts and regulations to this broad constituency, and also getting them involved in the process earlier on. So we completed the work last year, and it is now finally, it is going to be sent out to a lot of community organizations, and it will be posted up in libraries, both in hard copy format and through a eye-catching and engaging poster that will tell people that preservation is about so much more than the built environment, but it is about really preserving the fabric of our neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So really, this is just wrap up. Before I make a couple of closing comments, I want to acknowledge Martha Cross. Who valiantly took on this challenge of corralling 33 kind of fractious voices. And the fact that we're all singing as one right now is largely due to Martha's dexterity. Kathy Califano, who really was the leader of this behind the scenes as well as on the task force herself, kind of pulled together the group that ultimately kind of marshaled the resources to make this happen. So we're thankful for Kathy. And John Farnham, who leads our, wherever John is, our historical commission, who served quite kind of calmly on the sidelines as we kind of messed with his world, but I think has kind of quite in a gentlemanly fashion accepted the recommendations and is wholeheartedly kind of moving forward with what he can. And again, of course, to Councilman Squilla and to Mayor Kenny in absentia for being so receptive to the work of the task force, as well as to the voices that we heard throughout the city in terms of what is, I think, a momentous series of recommendations that is distinctly Philadelphia. That was part of our efforts to make this. We're not cutting and pasting from other cities. We really want to figure out what makes Philadelphia tick, how do we broaden the tent in Philadelphia, and how do we create something that is uniquely ours. And I think we accomplished that, and we're, on behalf of the task force, I'm going to express our pride in the work that we've done. With that, this is it. The work now moves forward to not only the city, but the citizens, the advocacy community, the preservation community, the academic community, the legal community, the preservation community. This is truly a joint effort, and I can say, as having chaired the task force, that it is with great pride that I kind of release this to the city and look forward to working with all of you on how we move forward. Thank you.
Ann Fedulin. So we are going to open up for questions. Those of you who have hung out with me this morning realize what I do is come in after the mayor and say, okay, what do you want to know now? So if you have any questions, we'll do our best to answer them. I know there's press packets that have been handed out, but yes, this gentleman.
Yes, a question for Harris Steinberg.
Yay, my favorite kind of question.
Well, I'm going to kind of answer as best I can and then call on any of the task force members for follow-up. At the moment, things are staying the same. There's status quo. There's no stay of execution, so to speak. So the development community hopefully will kind of embrace the tenets of the recommendations here and move forward in a way that are in the spirit of the task force. But ultimately comes up to the advocacy community and others to ensure that kind of the work has resonance moving forward. The city itself is organizing the internal task force, which is meant to bring together a variety of different disciplines from across the city to to connect the dots between preservation, planning, development, L&I. So it looks like Councilman Squilla.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, and speaking to many developers, is that they're really looking at the incentive point of this, the positive side of it, where they're saying that, ooh, let's wait and let's not do anything until we get all those incentives we need to make it easier to develop properties like this. So I think that, the sooner we get these out, working with planning to get this legislation and language in place with law and the Historic Commission to get this out there, they're waiting for that after they hear this so that they could get those incentives necessary to keep those buildings. Because believe it or not, I know a lot of developers get a bad name because some of them do the wrong thing, but there are a lot that are interested in preservation, and when you look at the architecture that we're saving, things like that, they get pretty excited about it. So I see it more of a positive role as wait until we get these in so they could use or take advantage of our incentives.
And I just want to say, so during everybody's speeches, Councilman was leaning over to me saying, how quickly can we get this legislation written, right? So I think that is a really key piece of this. I love just being like Vanna White.
That was actually one of the, it's not one of the ones on our first to-do list, but that was one of the recommendations from the task force to look at that. And I can't see why we can't add others as we move through this. Actually, we were looking at some of the historic, as if they were historic properties, to count that as land, so that any incentive to build additionally on those would give those abated, all improvements being abated at that time over the land value. That was something that was discussed during our preservation. It's not on our initial list, but it is on a list of things to look at and do. Thank you.
Ashley? You want to answer about why they rose to the top?
Well, Ashley, I guess just to clarify, are you asking why they rose to the top in terms of the administration's priorities? So that's for you.
There was many list of things to do for legislative-wise that we looked at. And I think we wanted to grapple with the ones we thought we could get through quickly and easily and less controversial than others that may give us some hiccups and get people against the idea of preserving it. The last thing we wanted to do is get an uproar of opposition. And so we thought if we could get some of these early wins in, we could build the momentum to then go after the tougher ones that may increase some angst from some of the community and some other folks. So that was the mindset behind it. The ones that got selected was done through a group of people to see that they thought, and these aren't easy. Some of these are still not going to be easy. But I think that was the mindset why we've selected certain priorities first and then work on the rest of the recommendations at a later time.
Right. So to answer for the administration, I think it ties into your second question, which is, unfortunately, I don't think we've got a big pot of money sitting to the side to say, okay, we're going to now do the whole report. So I think it was really taking a look at what could be done that's meaningful, that doesn't necessarily require a lot of additional resources. So I will say, we're already in the process of setting up the internal team. The Historical Commission has an RFP on the street about having someone assist us with modifying ARCHES, which was the open source software that LA did to do their survey. So there's things that we are, we know the report's released today, but, we got an advance copy, so we're starting to try to work on some things initially, and hopefully as we build momentum around this, and that people see what value it is to the city and why it's important, we can start tackling the resource question in a more meaningful way.
So at this point, no tax incentives, preservation, or informal zoning, parking along that
Correct. And, speaking with my former development hat on, less parking is almost a cash incentive. But I think, yeah, there's other ways to get, it's not going to be, here you go, we're going to give you money because you're going to preserve a building. I think what we're going to do is try to figure out how we incentivize that so it does hit the bottom line and makes it more cost-effective to do preservation. Oh, and we are, and the councilman has reminded me, thank you very much, that he is, one of the things he is going to introduce, or we're going to look at, is can we create a zoning bonus mechanism that would help to support a housing preservation trust fund. I'm going to go here, and then I'll go over there. Go ahead.
One of the biggest areas that we've been losing is historical resources that are critical. Has been the ability to get what they call their demo permit. Of course, all possibility of savings of it. It's happening at Church and Christian Street. Effectively, it's happening on Jordan's Road. Is there anything in the proposal to put forth in the short term before this comprehensive survey of the whole city, which may be more of a process than something that's delivered tomorrow? Is there something we could do in the short run that the task force recommends that would prevent this priority of demo permits over efforts to save?
Right, so I'll speak for the administration that the demo piece is always right, the balance between public safety and preservation. That is a responsibility that lies within LNI, and they take it very seriously. I do believe that the task force looked at the issue of demo delay. Do you want to talk about where they landed with that?
I'm going to ask Dominique to come up and talk about the index, which is a way that we sought to address this.
So the task force recommended the creation of an index separate from an inventory that really quickly identifies buildings across the city that merit, or I'll say that meet the requirements of designation on their face without the formal evaluation process, and then a time period in which the city has the ability to review those properties either as a demolition permit is pulled to see whether or not that they are listable, or review them sort of in sequence. So if there was a property that was listed on the index within that period of time, and I pulled it or tried to pull a demolition project, it would automatically get flagged by LNI and be transmitted directly to the Historical Commission for review for designation. So it's an interim step that would only be a one-time thing for a period of time until we could get a survey done. Yes.
If I could follow up. So in the meantime, the current priority of pulling over the other demo permit still prevails until the time when we have this comprehensive survey?
No. And I apologize if I wasn't clear. So what the idea is everyone knows the property in their neighborhood that they think is threatened. And there's a lot of good city data about historic buildings that are scattered throughout the city that are not designated, but may be threatened. So what the attempt will be is to assemble this list of properties that merit historic preservation on their face and merit the requirements of the ordinance for designation on their face, meaning not through a formal designation review process, and say, here's a list of 100 properties, maybe 100, maybe 1,000. I don't know what this magic list is going to be. For a period of time defined, we will not allow the demolition of that property without historical commission review as to whether or not it is eligible for listing on the Philadelphia inventory. So it's a really kind of pulled together process that's unfortunately unlike anything that's been done before. So. Does that need legislation?
I don't think there's any legislation required for that, but I think that's something that we're in the process of trying to figure out. Excuse me. I think we're in the process of trying to figure out how to get that done and how to, what would be the collection system for that information, how would people have access to it, and so those are some of the things that we're working on. Do we have a timeline? Not as of yet. I think once we have a better understanding of the scope, then we could probably provide some more information on timeline. Yeah. I got time for like 2 more questions because then we got to be.
So just to clarify, there's going to be an index of buildings that you can just think of immediately, and then you're going to do a survey. And just, but
The survey will be happening simultaneously. We can't survey the city as a whole all in one shot. But there is this recognition that there are these properties everywhere. So how can we bridge that gap? And this is a bridge the gap in a one-time effort. Okay? I'm not the MC,
yeah,
so I
right
can't
there.
choose.
Yeah, that's right.
So part of the challenge is that there are very few people who prepare these nominations. So a lot of people don't understand what is required to get a successful application through the process. So we are looking to establish guidance that will be available online to people as a citizen to nominate a property. Philadelphia is fairly unique in the ability of any citizen to be able to nominate any property with or without owner consent. So being able to provide information is how does one go